I'm going to talk to you about herd improvement. So Di's talked about soil carbon. Got to be a fantastic quote. I'm only a scientist, I'm not a carbon project developer. I've never heard that before. So all of a sudden scientists have dropped down another peg. But what Di actually showed was there is science behind these methodologies, and particularly in the soil world, but in most of these methodologies there's actually good reasons to undertake the activity because of the carbon benefit, regardless of the carbon economics. And soil carbon's a great example of that. So the soil carbon is fantastic because it makes you money anyway, and if you've got the ability to generate a carbon credit, then that's a bonus. What I'm going to do is cover off on an introduction to what livestock emissions are, how it works, then we'll talk about how you can reduce your emissions, and then we'll actually talk about how the methods work that you can generate a carbon credit from reducing your livestock emissions. Phil's got to remind me to answer the question that he asked earlier. So, avoided emissions. Cows emit methane. They don't actually do that, that's what kids in school think, they burp it. And so when we're talking about the emissions from livestock, we're talking about methane. There's also a small amount through urine. So how that works, anyone been to Animal Production 101? Everyone know how a cow works? Got the 4 stomachs, they chew a bit, chew up a whole heap of grass, stick it in here, goes through the reticulum, which sorts it for size and all sorts of stuff, shoots it through to the omosum, through the abomasum, and then back out the other end. What happens in here is cows are very, very impatient animals. They've got a lot to do in a day. So when they're chewing, they don't actually chew it properly. They just get it into their gut so that they can go and sit in the shade and relax for a bit. Incredibly busy things. Then when they're chewing their cud, and in the stomach you've got all the bacteria and stuff, it creates methane. They chew the cud, they regurgitate it, they burp out all that methane. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about emissions from cattle. So when you talk to, there's all sorts of different phrases that go around when people are talking about animal production. And when you're talking to people like me, we used to go out and try and convince pastoralists that they weren't actually about growing cows or sheep. They're actually about managing pasture. That's really what you do, you manage pasture. If you're an animal health person, you go out and you convince people that you don't actually manage pasture and you don't grow cows or sheep. What you do is grow these little bacteria that live in the cow's stomach, because that's the bit that's actually doing the work for you. That's why the 4 stomachs of the cow are critical. But they're also the things that are creating the methane. You've got all sorts of little nasty things in there and all sorts of gases which actually break down the cellulose in the plants and the veg that they're eating. Sometimes in northern South Australia they manage to break down rocks and stuff because there's no plants and vegetables to eat anyway. But generally all the work's happening in the stomach, but that's where the methane's coming from as well. So up until yesterday we knew how much cows emitted. Now we know again how much cows emit. What they do is they go around, they do a series of tests. They've done it, they've broken down cattle by age class, whether you're a cow carrying a calf, whether you're a bull, whether you're a 1-year-old, whatever. Sometimes they've gone the James Bond approach where they put these muzzles over them. Sometimes they've set them up in paddocks with sensors at either side of the paddock and you have a herd manipulating there. Sometimes they put them into tunnels. There's all different ways. All they're doing is trying to measure how much methane comes out of the beast. So for cows, on average, 60 kilograms of methane per head per year. We've done the same thing with sheep. This is actually down near Trangie, I think. Guess what? Sheep aren't as big as cows. Sheep don't emit as much as cows. But when you're looking weight for weight, it actually turns out to be pretty much the same. So they're about 8 kilos per head per year, and goats are about 5. So they're our 3 main livestock industries when we start to look at methane emissions. So when we talk about reducing methane emissions, we have to look at how that actually works out, how we're going to generate a carbon credit from that, and how we're actually going to reduce these emissions. And this is where we get to. In the introductory bit, I talked about a baseline. And so the critical part for the methods is establishing your baseline. So every cow you've got in the paddock, so that's one cow there, that's another one, that's another one, that's another one. they're going to be different in how efficiently they can turn food into protein and how much they emit doing that. Every beast is different, we know that. So the critical point that we want to look for is how many kilograms of CO2 equivalents. We talked about CO2 equivalents. They emit methane, but we convert it back to a CO2 equivalent number. How many kilograms of CO2 equivalents do they emit per kilo of live weight turned off? And your cows vary. Some cows are much more efficient than others. But what we have found is there's not that much of a difference between breeds. There's actually more variation within a breed than there is between breeds. And the new science backs that up as well. And what it also shows is the variation between systems. So we break, in Australia, we break the herd into basically an intensive and non-intensive, and a northern and southern herd. There's not that much difference between each of those situations. There's actually still more variation in the one paddock, same breed, different animals. So what we need to do though, to make this thing work in terms of the carbon project, is take our varied emissions here, then we're going to do something. So we've established our baseline, and we've done that over 3 years of data. So we've sat there and said, look, I've got, X number of breeders. Let's say we've got 100 cows, got a couple of bulls, and I'm turning off, what do you want to turn off? Say out of 100 cows up here, 75 a year or something? Would that be fair enough? 75% turn off? Maybe? I don't know, I don't want to assume too much. But you can sit there and say, okay, I'm turning them off at 300 kilos a head, so I can work out how much my live weight turn off is each year, and based on these figures I can work out what my methane emissions are to do that. So you end up with your profile for the herd of how much you're emitting to turn off each kilo of protein. We then do something, and that's the exciting bit. We get to go out and do something, and we'll talk about what that is, and we reduce our emissions. Now, we're not going to reduce them all the same because all those cows are going to be different. There's going to be variation in the herd still, but on average, we've reduced them all by, pick a number, 10 kilos of methane produced per year or something like that. And it's that difference that is the credible difference. That's what might generate a carbon credit unit. And so then you've got to work out whether I can generate a big enough difference to make it worth me generating a carbon credit unit and selling it. It's really, the concept itself isn't complicated, but how you make that difference can be. What you actually do can be quite complicated, or it can be quite simple. And so this is where the complication comes in. This is a fantastic guy by the name of Eckhard, knows all sorts of stuff about methane management in livestock. Has come up with this table, and I love this table. I show this in every talk I give, even if I'm talking about flying. I just think this is a great table, because you start at this end and you've got this rumen manipulation thing. So I told you that you don't actually grow cows and you don't manage pasture, you manage the bacteria in the rumen. So it's simple. You can go out with your cow's rumen, you can introduce bacteriophagus bacteriosis, you can do reductive acetogenesis. Does anyone, if anyone can tell me what reductive acetogenesis is, I'll buy you a beer at the end of the day. Anyone know what it is? Oh!
Reducing the amount of acetane in their system.
Give that man a beer. I've got to buy you a beer. I had to Google that last night because I can never remember it. I'm impressed. First person ever. You can vaccinate them. I call it Yakult for cows. You just give them yogurt or something and it changes the bacterial assemblage in the stomach. And you can do this chemical defaunation. You can really change the bacterial assemblages in the stomach so that it changes the emissions profile of how the stomach operates, basically. Anyone ready to race out of the room and go and do that? Do you do, what was it, reductive acetogenesis?
Oh, we just make sure that we don't bring it on when we're feeding grain to our livestock. So
Awesome. That's really cool. We'll have a chat when I give you that beer. But this one here, generally our producers look at that and go, yeah, that's great in theory. We actually know through science that works, but is it something you're actually going to do out in the paddock? And chances are it's not. You then start to move into diet manipulation. This is probably more within the scope of your average landholder in terms of the capacity you've got, the facilities you've got, the finances you've got. So you can change forage quality, you can do plant breeding. Particularly more of this happens in Queensland where people do more active management of pastures. If you look in South Australia, for instance, where there's no introduced pastures and very little active management, like active change in a pasture system, it's hard to do this. You can look at dietary supplements, lick blocks, all those sorts of things. They all increase the efficiency of the beast to turn cellulose food into protein, and they increase their efficiency in terms of methane. So this is actually starting to get into the realm of not only possibility, but is actually happening. So people go out there now. And one of the myths that we'll talk about later on is about nitrate supplements, and that fits into this sort of technology. The third one is the bit I like. I'm very simple. I'm not having a go at veg project developers or veg projects. It's just that I like it because it's, you know, it's fun chasing animals around. Animal breeding. Anyone in this room that does livestock doesn't do animal breeding at the moment? I don't know how you grow livestock if you don't. You just buy in small calves and fatten them up, but I don't know whether there'd be too much of that out here. You can look at feed intake and efficiencies, or you look at management systems. You're all doing this anyway. You're all looking at the management system, you're all producing livestock in some sort of system. And under these methodologies, what you can do is actually change the management system, change the animal breeding to get a more efficient herd and claim a carbon credit. And not only do you get to claim a carbon credit, you get to make more money because you are producing beef better, or lamb, or fibre, and you're also increasing the efficiency of your property. That's why I like these things, they make sense. Now, gratuitous bull shot, people are always interested in bulls, everyone's got to have a look at a bull. Anyone ever seen a Belgian blue? Does anyone here know what Google is? Go home and Google it, or ask your grandkids to Google it. These are fantastically bizarre animals. They but incredibly efficient. I'm not recommending that we all do this. There's some really horrible looking bulls out there. But the point is, there are all sorts of different things that occur to change the body size, the efficiency of the animal. What we're actually more talking about, rather than weight bodybuilding supplements, is actually nitrate supplementation. So this is occurring now. This is a method that is available now. And when you undertake this method, you are providing nitrate supplements rather than urea supplements. So you're changing the nitrate intake of the animal, which we've found is quite a big deficiency in the Australian herd in certain areas. And so by doing that, you actually change the methane efficiency of the beast because the beast is more productive. The problem with this one, so it's particularly good where you've got pastures that are low in protein, which is, you know, across a fair percentage of the Australian pastoral landscape. The problem with it is that it's probably not economic for smaller producers from a carbon credit point of view. The cost of the nitrate supplement will probably outweigh the potential financial benefit from the Australian Carbon Credit Unit. This is one of those things that might make sense to do anyway, but it's not financial in terms of the Carbon Credit Unit. Where it does work particularly well is for quite large operations in places like the Barclay Tableland. So if you think about your AACOs and that sort of stuff, this method works really, really well for them. Just checking time. Now, they're not just, again, we talked before, you've got to prove what you can do, you've got to follow a method, so you've got to follow this method. And there's rules in the method, and there's also a whole heap of information about the information you need to store, keep and prove to show that you're actually following the rules of the method. So you need to record things. There's actually calculators in there, so it's doable. You can actually go in and look at the calculators and have a bit of a play with them and see whether it's going to work for you. And it requires the data on where you are, on your cattle numbers, what your baseline stuff is, what your live weights are, and you know, a lot of this information is information that landholders would be keeping anyway. So even if you're a little bit interested in this sort of stuff but you don't want to jump into it, you can actually start running your data through it to see where you end up. And you can start to play with it that way. And that's no one's going to send you a set of steak knives or sign you up to anything to do that. You can just do that and have a look and start thinking about it yourself. But that's if you like balls like that one. I don't. I like ones like this one. And this methodology is the second one that's around at the moment, around herd efficiency. Now, I am concentrating on cattle. I'll talk about sheep in a minute. But this method to me it's a free. I mean, I said at the start, I'm not a project developer and I'm not here to sell you anything. This thing's a free kick. This really is. If you're a pastoralist and you're producing beef and you're interested in doing it better, or you're interested in establishing your property better, you may as well go onto the website and have a look at the calculators for this and see whether it adds anything to your game. Because the sort of stuff that you can do under this methodology is the sort of stuff that people are doing to increase the efficiency of their herd anyway. Now, this isn't made up stuff. There's plenty of trials around that have done this. I'll go through an example in the next slide. But this is talking about increasing your breeding rate. So you're carrying less cows for the number of calves that you're actually turning off. That's a simple one. If you've got less cows on there, your herd is emitting less methane. You can actually reduce the age of your first pregnancy, and we all know there can be implications for health around that, and depending on the breed particularly. But if you've got your cows breeding earlier, then your turn-off of calf at the other end occurs earlier. You're emitted less methane in producing that protein. Increase your weaning rate, reduce the age of market weight. If you can grow it up quicker and get it off the property, you make more money, you increase the turn-off on your property, and you emit less methane. Some of the things, I don't know, do many people down here do preg testing? No? Oh yeah, a few. So some in parts of, particularly northern South Australia, preg testing isn't very common. And so even just doing that preg testing and getting rid of your cows that aren't really pulling their weight is a real benefit. Got a question?
How do so you establish a baseline and then do something different to decrease it? How do you establish a baseline with the big change in weather and seasons?
In seasons, and you turn off on your seasons? You need to go in and look at the actual methodology. So they say it's a 3-year turnaround, and they'll tell you quite clearly what information they're looking for. So you're going to have real difficulties when you're looking at coming out of a totally destocked situation, for instance. But you need to be able to demonstrate your 3 years of cattle management prior to undertaking the project change. And some people even may not have the information. So some people, we all know, like some of us are a little bit more relaxed with our records than others. If you're interested in doing this and you don't have those records, then you'll need to actually look at it. But there's a fair bit of flexibility in there. Like it has been written to try and make it as easy as possible for people to engage in it. There's all sorts of stuff you can do. You can do things like breaking down your herds size so that you're grazing age for age, so that you've reduced competition, so therefore your younger beasts are going to actually grow up quicker. There's all sorts of different things you can do. Most of them, well, all of them require a change in management, but most of them also require some sort of financial input. And that's the challenge. That's where the additionality comes in. So the Australian government looks at that and says, well, if you're not doing it already, and then you decide to do it because of the carbon credit, the finances that you might be able to get from it, that's additional. But what you might be sitting there thinking is, I've wanted to do some of this stuff, because some of this stuff, like non-competitive grazing amongst age classes, that takes fence lines, it takes water points, it takes infrastructure, so you can actually organise your herd throughout your property. You could be sitting there saying, I've been wanting to do this for years, but who's got the cash for that? Or you could do the maths, use the calculators and say, well, actually, if the carbon credit unit is going to contribute this much to the bottom line, and I think I'm going to increase my productivity by this much, does that actually get me across the line for doing that fence line or the water points I wanted to do, or buying in the different bull that I wanted so that my breeding rate was higher, or changing my cows? Is that the way that I'm going to pay for the loss I'm going to cop when I sell off all the cows at the moment that they're producing, but they're not producing as much as I'd like them to? Generally, when people are restocking, they go back in and they'll buy anything they can because there's just not a lot around and you're not in a position to be that fussy. But you can actually start to look at, well, what's the paddock structure? What's my grazing management going to be like when I kick this thing back into gear again? These are some real figures. You'll notice I haven't put a single dollar figure in there because I do not provide financial advice. But this is as an example that was run up in Georgetown. So they started off with 25 kilos of CO2 equivalents per kilo of live weight turned off. They did a whole heap of things. They managed the herd structure, selective breeding. They changed their sales strategy for non-performers, segregation of first joining, first calf and second half heifer groups into individual paddocks. They did some feed supplementation. They targeted reduced weight at first pregnancy and they improved property condition. They spent a lot of money on infrastructure. It was a very undeveloped property. But they were able to reduce the emissions in that herd to 11 kilos. So they reduced it by 14 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilogram turned off. Now they were turning off 1,500 head at about 300 kilos. So you go down the bottom there and you've got 1,500 head by 300 kilos. We've gone from 14 kilos to 0.014 tonnes because everything's in tonnes, remember? So they ended up with potential saving there of 6,300 tonnes of CO2 equivalent a year. So if you did that and you followed the method, you registered the project, you kept all your records, you did it in line with the Australian government's method, you would have the potential to turn that 6,300 tonnes saving into 6,300 Australian carbon credit units. Now the reason there's nowhere near as much activity in this as there is in, say, vegetation credits, is because if you're doing a vegetation project, you probably don't get out of bed for 6,300 tonnes. Like they're talking, hundreds of thousands of tonnes. But if you're a landholder and you wanted to implement a new management strategy for your herd, 6,300 tonnes, turn that into 6,300 Australian carbon credit units, and the average price at the last auction was somewhere around $13 a tonne. What's that work out to be? Anyone good with maths? What's 6,300 times 13? There's another beer in the market.
80,000.
There you go. 2 beers. So that's a reasonable amount of money. That's, an increase of between 30 and 50 bucks a head that they've turned off. Now, if a livestock dealer was going to rock up and say to you, hey, look, sell your cows this way, or sell them this way and I'll give you an extra 30 to 50 bucks a head, which one are you going to take? Look, that's a reasonable return for a head. It's not, it's not going to set the world on fire, but for doing something that you enjoy doing, for making your business more efficient, and for maybe covering the cost of the changes that you need to make, it's not a bad way to go. That's why I like reduced emissions from livestock. I think they make sense anyway. We had a whole heap of questions about the risk in the market. Someone was talking about policy risk. Some people asked me questions over the break about risk in the price of what a carbon credit's going to do and how much it costs to produce a carbon credit. If you did something like this, the risk is still there, but the impact on your bottom line is nowhere near as great, because this really is the cream at the top if you're getting your management benefit anyway. That's all I have about livestock emissions. I know I didn't make that sound very exciting, but they really are.
Over what time period did they do that?
It was over a couple of years, so they needed to show, and they haven't actually, all this work was done before the meth was written, the current meth was written. So they haven't actually generated a carbon credit unit. In fact, I don't think anyone has using this methodology yet. No? So, you could be a world leader. That you can be doing this work as well as doing a soil carbon project, as well as doing a vegetation project, for instance. So you could be looking at multiple benefits.
Could could I just add to it in response to that question? I'm from the Department of the Environment. As Louisa said as well, John mentioned in that example I did a number of things, and so it might take a couple of years to get up to that man. And so if you're doing a number of different activities in that first year or two, it might be a bit less, and then you might be able to maintain it. I also wanted to pick up on Peter's question from this morning about that new research. So I did a bit of checking because I didn't know that article was coming out yesterday. All the methods that we've been talking about use emissions estimation methods that are used in our national greenhouse gas inventory. So the government has to put in a report internationally each year on its emissions, and all of the methods that are used in that inventory have to be internationally reviewed. There's lots and lots of things in there that are specific to Australia. The work that Di talked about earlier with the full CAN model is used for a lot of the land inventories. As far as I understand, that work from CSIRO, which has a lot of input across a lot of the inventory, what was reported is work that's actually been coming, of course, for a fair while. The inventory comes out in the first half of the year each year, and this year the livestock inventory had a few updated factors in it from that work, and will be updated further next year, directly incorporating that work. So it is a key part of what's in there. The herd management method that John's just been talking about, we've been developing that in parallel, and so it's actually already incorporated, but will be updated in the background. There's a calculator for that method as well, so that'll be fully consistent. So if the numbers shift down, everything shifts down. So it also lines up. Does that make sense?
So what we're referring to there is there was a report that came out yesterday that showed that Australia's emissions from livestock wasn't as great as we first thought it was. And they do that through some of that work, those pictures I showed you with the scuba tanks on the cows, and based on a lot of international and Australian data, so they've just refined the data. And there's also the mechanism to actually update the maths over time as well. So as more and more interest builds into the market, the science will get stronger and stronger behind some of these maths, and so then they're updated. But I don't know whether Di referred to the concept of it, she didn't say it like this, but being fit for purpose, fit for the market. So we get to a point where we're comfortable with the level of detail and the scientific knowledge we have, that we're comfortable that we're buying something that's real. And we'll just evolve that over time. I've just got one down the back here, and then I'll come over there.
I was just wondering whether there's been any work done on gene markers to identify DNA, identify more efficient stock.
Yep, there is, and you can go in, if you go through and look through your gene markers in the book, there is the genes identified for methane efficiency. So you can do that.
I'm just wondering, along with what Guy said before and what you were just saying then, how will those changes possibly affect the reporting conditions? If you get locked in now and you think, this is what you're getting from what you're telling us you're going to do, and you need to report every 6 months, I don't know the process yet, I might talk to you later, but if there are changes in how we work out how much carbon is in the soil and systems get better, if this sort of thing where a report comes out that it's changed, it may go up, it may go down, will that affect you? Is it locked in when you sign the dotted line, this is what I'm going to do for 25 years? If they then find out in 5 years' time, oh, we actually made a mistake in how we calculated that, is that going to affect us down the track?
So there's a whole heap of things there, and Paul will touch on just about all of that, I think, in his talk. In short, there's different contract time periods. So we were talking about, so if you're talking avoided emissions, you make it happen once, you can change your management system next year. You can move on, you can decide, actually, no, I'm not going to grow cows anymore, I'm going to do something else. That's fine. If you're talking about vegetation, you have a requirement for permanence, which is that locked in for 25 or 100 years. Regardless of whether we find a change in the calculations on how much carbon you're actually storing, you're still going to have that requirement for permanence. But then there's another period, which is your contracted sale period, basically. So if you go through the process, you generate a carbon credit unit, you put it through the reverse auction, and the Australian government says, yep, we like your proposal, we'll buy those from you. They will sign a contract for you. And that's a contract for delivery period. If the science changes, that contract stands. But the delivery period may be different for different project types or whatever you've bid into the auction. So that contract period with the Australian government, it's a purchase contract. It's not going to change. The intent is you can actually propose a project type, register it, make sure you're right on top of the ball, you're fair income about this. You can put your proposal into the option, and then the feds say, yep, okay, we'll buy that. You've got a contract that you could even then take to a bank, for instance, and say, look, I've got a guaranteed income stream here for the next 5 years. Will you loan me the money to make this happen? There's that sort of theory in it. So that contract is concrete.